So, Tony, this study is often called the first proof that simulation training actually transfers to the operating room. Before this paper, what were surgeons relying on, and why was that a problem?
Yeah, the virtual reality training for the operating room, or the VR-OR paper, was published in 2002 in Annals of Surgery in October, I think. It was a citation classic by Christmas. The study was set up to solve a problem, an existential problem that surgery had. Traditionally, they had relied on an apprenticeship model where the master surgeon supervised the trainee surgeon in the operating room, and the trainee surgeon learned hands-on on real patients. And skills labs and training labs were almost unheard of throughout the world. And laparoscopic surgery had been introduced in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and very quickly it became clear that the apprenticeship model for the training and supervision of a trainee performing these procedures on patients simply didn't work, or it was too risky. Because what was not really appreciated in surgery, that moving the performance of surgery from looking inside a patient directly with their eyes to moving it onto a monitor caused fundamental problems. Number one, the monitor, no matter how high quality it was, did not produce the same quality of image as the eye produces under natural viewing conditions. And when this happens, it increases the processing required from the brain enormously. The oxygen and glucose metabolism increased exponentially. But one of the more fundamental problems in laparoscopic surgery is what I termed the fulcrum effect of instrument manipulation. And I demonstrated quantitatively how big of a problem this was when I'd worked at Queen's University, Belfast, in the late 1990s. And basically what it is, the surgeon introduces an instrument through the port into the patient's abdomen. And when the surgeon moves his or her hand to the right, the working end moves to the left on the monitor. And that causes a fundamental proprioceptive challenge to the brain. Now, the brain will automate, they'll automate in time, but what I suggested was that automating this problem on a real patient is too risky. Rick Satava, in the United States, he was working as a program manager in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, had proposed that the operating room was not the place to acquire these skills. He proposed that the skills, the basic skills, be acquired in skills labs outside the operating room and on virtual reality simulators. And virtual reality simulators had been around for a while, but to be quite frank, they didn't really work. The computer processing capacity wasn't there to simulate real tissue formation. I mean, even today, virtual reality simulators can't realistically simulate, suture thread behavior. And Johnson & Johnson, the Ethicon division of Johnson & Johnson, came to me with a simulator and they said, Tony, we know you're into the objective assessment of surgical skills. Can you look at the simulator and tell us, is it any good? And rather than being a physics-based virtual reality simulator, it was more of an emulator. Instead of actually trying to simulate the tissue and the tissue instrument manipulation, they had come up with abstract tasks that trained the appropriate psychomotor coordination. As soon as I saw it, I said, one, a psychologist was involved in the design of this, and number two, that'll work. And really, that was the virtual reality simulator that we used at Yale. A lot of the surgical community looked at it, and they said, well, that looks nothing like real tissue. That's really not going to work. And Yale afforded me the opportunity to do a prospective, randomised and blinded study. And the evidence clearly showed that it produced significantly better performance in the trainee than the other simulation-type training platforms, such as, intercorporeal suturing and so on.
And speaking then, Tony, to that significantly improved performance, the VR-trained residents made 6 times fewer errors than your control group. But you didn't just train them on the simulator and hope for the best. You set a specific performance criterion. Why was that the critical design decision?
At this point, I was a director of the Northern Ireland Laparoscopic Surgical Training Centre, and we trained, all of the surgical disciplines. And one of the things I noticed over the 2 or 3 day courses that we ran is that some people left the course really skilled and they got it and they were able to, use the laparoscopic instruments well and safely. Others were unable to. And so what that taught me was, okay, the training for the 1 or 2 days or 3 days, for some individuals, this really didn't work. We needed a better approach. And from my behavioral science knowledge, the way that we would approach this is we would train individuals till they met a certain performance criterion. The issue was, how do we establish the performance criterion? And there was a huge debate in surgery at that time, that there should be a certain number of trials that the trainee should do. They should spend a certain amount of time in training, either in the skills lab or on tasks or whatever. And I wasn't convinced that that was going to work. From behavioral sciences, we train somebody to meet the performance criterion. I call this the Proficiency Benchmark. And the reason I called it the Proficiency Benchmark, it was established on the basis of the objectively assessed performance of surgeons who were practicing laparoscopic surgeons. And we knew that they were good surgeons. We knew that they went in and they operated regularly and frequently, and they were recognized as good. We didn't set it on the world experts. We set it on surgeons who go into hospital Monday to Friday or Monday to Sunday in some cases, and they functioned perfectly well. And so we had them perform the exact same tasks that we were going to train the trainees on the simulator or whatever else. And we established the proficiency benchmark based on the mean performance of how they completed the task.
Okay. So, Tony, the control group were 9 times more likely to fail to make progress during the procedure. What does that tell us about what happens when someone enters a high-stakes environment without having reached proficiency first?
The failure to make progress during a procedure or a task is not just surgery. It means that the person is probably not ready to have to be performing that task independently. We generated that metric initially from the study at Yale because we would see we were developing the metrics from watching videos of laparoscopic cholecystectomy, and we would see that the surgeon, the trainee surgeon, and sometimes the attending surgeon, they had the instruments in the abdomen. The instruments might have been moving, but they really weren't achieving anything. And so we decided we would score that because there was no specific error that they were making, but they weren't progressing the procedure or the task. And what it indicates is the person's probably not ready to do the task. And it was at that time that I was convinced not only did the person have to know how to do the procedure, the phases, the steps, what instruments they should be using and so on. I mean, also the errors. But they needed to know that information before they got to the operating room. And what that pointed to me was we needed to move training to an online learning platform. The issue with lectures is that when you can do a really good lecture, you can, give the information that the trainee requires, you can give it in an easily understandable format. But when the trainee gets up off their seat, you have absolutely no idea what their mind could have been something different. Whereas online learning, we set the proficiency benchmark again on the experienced surgeons or the experienced operators, and we established again the mean performance on the online learning. And they had to pass at that benchmark before they get to the operating room. Then, obviously, we trained them in the skills lab to reach a proficiency benchmark on the performance of the task. But if they were struggling in the skills lab and failing to make progress, we knew that wasn't because they didn't have the knowledge. It was really a psychomotor skill issue. And so when we supervise somebody, we know where we're aiming our help for these individuals. Because the skills lab is not some sort of assault course. It's basically there to allow the trainee to integrate their knowledge with the technical skills. Because what we're asking them to do with image-guided interventional medicine is very challenging. And our job there is to help the trainee be able to perform the task well and perform the task safely. And so it's that package of the online learning, the prior knowledge that we know they have, and their technical skills. And that means that in the PBP trained individuals, we very rarely see failure to progress.
You used experienced laparoscopic surgeons to set the benchmark. How do you establish what good enough actually looks like, and why do most training programs get that wrong?
We used experienced laparoscopic surgeons to set the benchmark because of all the issues around surgery at that time, agreeing, okay, how long do we train somebody, how many trials do we train them for, and so on. And my experience in training courses, it meant that you produced a very variable or heterogeneous skills level in trainees at the end of the course. And the logical solution to that problem was to go to the surgeons who were actually doing the procedures, who were experienced in the procedures, were recognised as good at the procedure. You objectively assess their performance on the exact same task you're going to train on, and you establish the benchmark on the mean performance of the experienced surgeons. The mean performance, probably because rather than the median performance, is because I'm more a fan of parametric rather than non-parametric statistics. And also, with the experienced surgeons, we also have outliers. Well, number one, we have a distribution of performance. Some of them are really good, some of them are okay, and some of them are maybe not so good. And if you take the mean, that's a reasonable level for the trainee to aim at. But as Frank Lewis, who was the chair of the American Board of Surgery at the time, he says, Tony, that's an awful high benchmark. Because for the trainee to pass, they've got to perform better than 50% of the individuals the proficiency benchmark was established on. And that was right. And for a while, it worried me until we started applying it in courses. And what we saw is that we could get the vast majority to the proficiency benchmark during a reasonable amount of time. There was very few that we needed to train for extra time. Up until relatively recently, we didn't know whether we could get everybody to proficiency. Stefano Pugliati has unambiguously answered that question. And the answer is yes, we can get everybody to the proficiency benchmark. And this is not just in surgery. The same is applied in interventional cardiology, interventional radiology, anesthetics, communication skills, and outside medicine in industry. We find that establishing the benchmark based on the experienced practitioners, whether it's somebody trying to identify utilities in the road, or whether it's somebody going up into the brain with a catheter and wire to take out a clot that's causing a stroke, this approach to training seems to work every time.
Okay. So, Tony, this was a double-blinded study. The attending surgeons didn't know who had been VR trained. Why was that blinding so important to the credibility of the findings?
Prospective, randomised and blinded studies are the gold standard in almost any area of science. And one of the issues, Satava had talked about the first virtual reality simulator, and he had demonstrated proof of concept in 1991, and there were lots of simulators about. The range from being absolutely appalling to some of them were pretty good. And the medical community, they're not engineers. These are clinicians. The language that they understand for evidence is prospective, randomised and blinded. And I knew that that's what we had to do. I tried to do it in Northern Ireland, and most of the surgeons thought I needed help. In England, weren't that interested either. I went to the chief of surgery at Yale, and he asked me what I wanted to do. I was Fulbright Distinguished Scholar at the time, so his door was always open to me. And I said, I want to do a prospective, randomised, double-blinded study on simulation-based training for the operating room. And Dana Anderson immediately said, we can do that here. And we had a discussion with the surgeons that were going to be involved in the study, and we all agreed that it had to be prospective, randomised and blinded. But no study at the time had been prospective, randomised and blinded. Indeed, some senior people in the surgical community believed that it wasn't doable. And when we first talked about it at a meeting in Boston College with the American College of Surgeons, the American Board of Surgery, somebody actually said that it's not doable. And a chairman of surgery from Canada turned around to me and with a scrap of paper, he says, was that the design study? And I says, that's right. And it's subsequently become the default methodology for the evaluation, not just of simulation-based training, but other types of simulations and other types of tools in medicine.
So, Tony, for the VR-OR study, you measured 8 specific observable errors rather than using global ratings or Likert scales. What's the problem with asking a supervisor to rate someone's performance on a scale of 1 to 5?
Likert scales are useful in certain contexts. They were designed originally for assessing attitudes towards things, personality type, and so on. But they're inappropriate for the evaluation of technical skills. I regularly test them, and one of the fundamental problems that I've observed in almost every study is we fail to achieve a high level of inter-rater reliability with the Likert scales, number one. And if the inter-rater reliability is below 0.8, it doesn't matter how good the test is, it doesn't matter how good the metrics are. If it doesn't demonstrate an inter-rater reliability above 0.8, it's by default not valid. That was a hard message for me to take initially. And so therefore I'm quite scrupulous about designing the assessment. Likert scales also, they appeal to the surgical community because it allows them to do an assessment, but the assessment is totally subjective. And the reason we have low inter-rater reliabilities is that the two surgeons can think they agree on the same thing. They could have gone to the same medical school, they could be from the same year, they could have had the same lectures and all the rest of it. And when you get them to score the same video recorded procedure, you can see that there's significant differences on their scoring. That's because they bring their own subjective and life experience to the assessment. And one of the things that I learned from the trainees, they were intimidated and frightened by the fact that if a surgeon, a senior surgeon or a senior cardiologist or whatever didn't like them, they could bring that into the assessment scenario. The metrics that I developed were entirely to do with the objectively assessed performance of the trainee, what they did and what they didn't do. And errors, what we've learned over the last 2.5 decades, errors are the most sensitive measure to change as a result of training. The steps, what we see is the steps of the procedure, the vast majority of trainees learn to do that. What they don't learn to do, or what it's not systematically learned to do, is what not to do. And that's why you need the experienced surgeons to identify, okay, you probably shouldn't have done that, which would be an error. And critical errors, what the hell are you doing? And you're not just, you may not like the trainee, but you're not assessing whether you like them or don't like them. You're assessing what they do. So it's a much fairer, it's more objective assessment approach for the trainee. And on top of that, if they're making certain errors in the skills lab, you can give them constructive, formative feedback on the performance. And they respond, the trainees respond exceptionally well. These are smart, motivated, conscientious individuals. And our job in the skills lab and in the didactic portion of education and training is to help them to reach the proficiency benchmark, not set obstacles in their way. But what is non-negotiable is they have to demonstrate the proficiency benchmark. And it turns out that that's really not a huge problem for the vast majority.
Yeah. I've seen the metrics deployed in training for the skills assessment, and it's the level of a structure they give the formative feedback is fantastic, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, one of my fellows, I initially trained him to assess the video recorded ROR procedures for the construct validity. He was young. He was working in London at the time. He's now back in Belgium as a consultant. And what he says to me, it changed his entire approach to understanding, how he was doing in a procedure, because he evaluates them. Surgeons evaluate themselves all the time, but it gave him a structure. And not only did it give him a structure, he knew what he was doing right, what he was doing wrong. And on top of understanding his own behaviour, it taught him how to learn to do a new procedure, what approach to take. And it has changed his approach to training your juniors, because now you can focus. We divide the procedure up into phases and then steps and errors. But the phases allow him to focus in. And he said the approach is much more structured. And that skeleton of a structure, and it's got so many positive ramifications for education and training.
Hello. So, Tony, the VR to OR paper was published in 2002, and that's over 20 years ago. Why are most training programs in surgery and beyond still not training to a proficiency criteria?
Most training programs are not training to a proficiency criteria because I think a lot of the people in charge of the program think that proficiency-based progression is too difficult to do. They think it's too difficult or too challenging to develop and then validate the metrics. But there's also a failure of leadership and a failure to understand the consequences of not training somebody properly. Most organizations, most countries, they concentrate on building the building or finding space for a training center. They have the money to buy simulations. And what they fail to appreciate is the amount of staff and the amount of staff time that they actually need to make that a really good and effective simulation center. So there's a failure of leadership, number one, either not knowing or thinking there's an easier solution to this here. But there's also a significant implementation gap that, there's multiple causes for that there. I mean, either they buy the wrong simulators or they have the wrong attitude to the use of the simulations. Most of the simulation centers that I visit, they have this beautiful space. They have the simulators and they have the animal tissue or animal that, and they think pointing the trainee at the simulations and telling them to learn is sufficient. It's not sufficient. The simulator is a tool for the delivery of a curriculum. It's not a magic bullet. And you've got to have a package. You have to have the online learning. Well, number one, you have to have the metrics because everything flows from the metrics. And once you have the validated metrics and the benchmarks, you're ready to establish a curriculum. You need an online curriculum because what we've shown unambiguously is that giving people information by the traditional lectures is ineffective. You have no idea what they walk away with. So that means most of it's got to be moved online, benchmarked, and the trainee doesn't get to the skills lab until they actually reach that benchmark. Number two, that allows us more space or more time in the skills lab. And that means that really we can concentrate on the integration of the knowledge that the trainee has acquired to the skills that they need to learn to perform the procedure safely. And that means supervised practice. Proficiency-based progression works because of deliberate practice. We're not just saying to the trainee, okay, do that procedure and get on with it. We'll have two or three trainees at a station at a time, and there'll be somebody there supervising them, and they will know the metrics. The trainee, they knows the metrics because they passed the online didactic, and that means that the person supervising the trainee on the simulation station can say, are you sure you want to do that? Why would that be wrong? Or is there anything wrong with it? Are you sure you've got the right catheter or the right wire or the right instrument? And what we've found is that accelerates learning enormously. Because these kids, they're smart, they're motivated, they're at the course because they want to learn how to do the procedure safely. They know that if they leave the course, our course today, and they're not really prepared and ready to perform a procedure in a life, this is very pressurizing for them in the operating room. One of the trainees on the Yale study, the VR-OR study, she took the longest to train to proficiency. And the chief of surgery at the time was considering whether he was going to allow her to progress into her chief year, which is her final year. And she was randomised to the PBP training. And the chief of surgery said to me, he did her index case, rather the case that we were assessing. And he said to me, you trained her. And I said, I can't tell you, this is a blinded study. He said, you trained her. And I said, how do you know her? What makes you think that? He says, because the girl that I had in the operating room yesterday was different from the person that I supervised 4 weeks ago. And so it means that the trainee, they've got more confidence because they know what they're doing. It's really getting on with it. They have the attentional capacity. Their skills have automated. They've got their attentional capacity to be aware of what's going on around them. And she was in control. All she needed was the space for her skills to automate. She took the longest, and to be quite frank, I don't really care how long they take. What's non-negotiable is they demonstrate the benchmark before they progress. And her problem was, when she was good, she was really good, and when she was bad, she was pretty bad. But she learned through deliberate practice training on the simulator, she learned how to improve her performance and make it more consistent. And the skills lab is a safe place for the trainee to learn, and it's less pressurizing than learning on a real patient, because these kids, they care.
Okay. So I hope that what comes from this podcast series, Tony, is that people who are worried about the difficulty of implementing PBP will recognise the fact that there's supports available both from yourself and from other organisations to make it less difficult to implement. But more importantly, from a leadership perspective, that people realise that this is training that really does move the needle and improve patient safety and skills acquisition. And therefore, it shouldn't be an optional. It's a have to. It's a have to have.
I mean, any organisation I go into, initially for the development and validation of the metrics and then implementation on a training program, I make sure that there's a group of individuals that are senior individuals or mid-level individuals that I teach the methodology to, that they understand the methodology, and so that they can implement what we've just implemented. They can do it themselves, even with just a little support or no support from me. I mean, like Rick Angelo and I completed the ANA study in 2014. We published it in 2015. Rick was on the Zoom call to me last night because there was a set of data that he wasn't entirely sure about how to set the benchmark. We had a 5-minute call. He knew how to set the benchmark. And the reason is that he's been trained in the methodology, he understands the methodology, but he also has enough sense to know, I'm not sure what to do here, I'll give Tony a call. It's a 5-minute call. And the answers were important, because the Arthroscopic Association of North America had spent a fair bit of money on the study. I mean, so the help and support is there, and once you establish the relationship and the rapport, it's there indefinitely.
Yeah. Very good point. So, Tony, the 2002 Yale study proved VR training works. This 2005 paper is where you laid out how to actually do it. Why was that step, the methodology, the harder problem to solve?
The 2005 paper published in Annals of Surgery described proficiency-based training as a paradigm shift in surgery. And to be quite frank, it started out that I didn't think there was a necessity to write it. We'd described the methodology, I thought, in reasonable detail in the VR-OR paper. I was a visiting professor in Penn State, and Randy Hallock, who's the professor of surgery there, very good surgeon, he ran the simulation lab, and we were talking one evening, and he said to me, I said, well, why aren't you using it? He says, because I don't know how to use the methodology. I said, what? He said, you assume that we know how to use the methodology. He said, you're going to need something more than that. We're going to need the recipe. And the simulation paper in Annals of Surgery in 2005 really was the recipe. It was the cookbook. It explained the thinking behind proficiency-based progression training. It also explained, okay, this is how you develop the metrics. These are who you want to develop the metrics. This is how you set the benchmark. This is how you do the validation, and so on. And it's been updated somewhat, but basically the core principles of proficiency-based progression training are in that 2005 paper.
And in that paper, Tony, you make a sharp distinction between education and training. Most organizations use these words interchangeably. Why does that confusion cause real problems, in your opinion?
Because education and training are related, but they're not the same. Education is about teaching individuals something. It's about transmitting knowledge about something. Training is different. Training is about the acquisition of skills. Yes, they're related. They're very strongly related. For example, if somebody doesn't know what to do, they're going to have a lot of challenges and a very challenging experience trying to learn those skills. So what I do now, 20 years on from that paper, is that number one, I insist that the education component of the education and training approach is done before they get to the skills lab, because the skills lab is very expensive space. And what it means is that the trainee is prepared for the skills lab. Medicine for centuries has done excellent education, and the training was approached apprenticeship style. For the 21st century, for the new technologies, for the new approaches, and so on, that's no longer effective. And so it's really about the precision of language, that individuals, you can't just say I do education when you really mean training, and vice versa. You actually need both. And the education part can't just be imparting knowledge and assuming that the trainee has actually got it. You need to check, you need to verify. And I don't mind how many times they have to do or how long they have to spend on the online didactic. But what's non-negotiable is they don't get to the skills lab until they demonstrate the knowledge level that is established by the objectively assessed performance of the experienced practitioners. And what we find is that the time saving of this education component online to a proficiency benchmark, it's enormously time saving in the skills lab. And you know what to concentrate on the skills lab then, the training component of it. But the two are separate. They're correlated, but they're separate.
Okay. And in this paper as well, you introduce this idea of the pre-trained novice, someone whose basic skills are automated before they ever touch a patient. What does that actually mean in terms of how the brain handles attention?
The brain processes information, and as it learns, what it does, it chunks information together. So that, if you're trying to get a child to remember something, say 1945, you're trying to get them to remember those numbers or that number sequence. The brain initially will treat that as 4 discrete units of information. But once they learn to use organizational tactics, 1945 is 1945, it's when the Second World War ended. And so what we want them to be able to do is to chunk information, because that's a much more efficient approach for the brain to be processing information. The reason that's important is because if a trainee is learning to coordinate instruments, laparoscopic instruments or catheters and wires, and they're looking down at their hands, they've only got a certain amount of attentional capacity. That's going to use up their attentional capacity. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. I remember when I started to learn to ride a bicycle, I was looking at the front wheel or looking at the handlebars, and I wasn't looking where I was going. And so that didn't always work out so well. But once you learn to pedal the bike and to steer, and it's automated, what that means is the brain has much more processing capacity or attentional capacity to observe what's going on around you. You can see a pothole and you can steer around it. You know whether you want to take this road or that road, or you want to go to that street or whatever. In the operating room, I want the trainee, for their technical skills such as guiding wires, catheters, laparoscopic, I want those skills automated. They don't even have to think what they're doing, whether to put counterclock torque on the catheter. I want those skills to be automated so they can concentrate on doing the procedure. I also want those skills automated so that they're aware of what's going on in their immediate environment. So that if they're concerned about something, or if they want suction, or if they want assistance from their training or from the surgeon that's assisting them, they can give them a specific direction. If their skills haven't automated, they're not going to be able to do that. And you do not want them automating their skills in the OR, because as well as the skills being automated and everything else that's going on in the operating room, the trainee will be stressed when they first start doing these procedures. And you've got to add that. And the stress will compromise attentional and cognitive capacity. In the operating room, we want the majority of their attention to be how to do the procedure safely, what's the next step, what's the errors to avoid here. And we want them to be aware of the instruction that the consultant or the attending surgeon is giving them. If they're still automating their instrument coordination, they won't have that attentional capacity. And you want that automation to occur outside the operating room in a safe environment.
And that holds, Tony, for other disciplines and other industries as well. So you want the automation of a line worker in a pharmaceutical plant to have that level of automation, and same with communication skills, or say with road working and high voltage line detection with the likes of the Reach Active study. You want all a certain core set of skills to be automated, and this so that they can focus on the task at hand ultimately.
Yeah. The automation is attentional capacity is a fundamental cognitive structure or unit of a human being. It doesn't matter who they are. We all have a limited attentional capacity. We can only attend to so many things at a given time. If the technical skills of the surgeon or the utilities worker or the factory line worker or the production line worker, if they're concentrating on, okay, what am I supposed to do next, rather than knowing what they're supposed to do next and actually doing it and attending to what's going on around them. Individuals that have not automated these skills, this is across any industry, any aspect, any discipline in medicine, it's the exact same thing. If any individuals who have not automated the fundamental and basic skills are going to have compromised attentional capacity. That means that if something's going wrong on the production line, they're not going to notice it. And it's not that they intentionally won't notice it. It's just they don't have the attentional capacity to see it. We want individuals who are optimally prepared to work in the situation that they're working in. And we want them to be aware, not just, okay, these are the steps I'm supposed to. You want them to be aware of when things are not going the way that they should be. And you want them to spot it as early as possible. Because if it progresses, usually that's when you find that there's more serious consequence, whether it's a patient outcome or whether it's on the production line or whatever.
Okay. So, Tony, this paper says that the number of procedures someone has performed is at best a crude predictor of actual performance. That's a direct challenge to how most credentialing works. Why is case volume such a poor measure?
Case volume has been used for decades as an indicator of experience and skill, and actually it's been used as a surrogate for skill. But one of the things that I noticed is in the skills lab and in the operating room is that individuals could have done like 1,000 procedures, but when you were looking at the performance, you would think they seem to have only done a few procedures. Individuals can have done 1,000 procedures, but they've learned nothing over the number of procedures that they've done. It's really down to how good the person is who's doing the procedure. And what the Berkmeyer study shows is that it's not. They used experienced laparoscopic surgeons in the study, and they wanted to look, okay, the outcome for patients. Was that predicted by the experience? And it wasn't. It was the intraoperative performance of the surgeon that best predicted the outcome. Curtis, for a colorectal procedure, I've demonstrated the exact same thing. So experience is good, so long as the person is developing wisdom along the way. But if they're doing the exact same thing for all of those procedures, I mean, they're not acquiring wisdom. What they're doing is acquiring numbers. And really what you want to do, we're teaching the trainee, one, how to perform the procedure in a straightforward patient and a straightforward case at the start of their learning curve. But what we've done is we've given the foundations for them to build wisdom, because you then want them to go on and do more complex cases at a pace that they or their superiors feel comfortable with. And that ensures that they're building wisdom rather than just procedure numbers. Procedure numbers is a very poor indicator of the quality of the person who's actually doing the task. I mean, it's correlated, yes. It's a very weak relationship. And why would you use procedure numbers when you actually can measure skill? And that's the take home I had from the studies that we have done and from the Berkmeyer and the Curtis studies, which actually looked at the outcomes. It's the skill, the intraoperative skill and the deployment of that skill during the procedure that predicts, the outcomes. And the outcomes is what we're interested in. It doesn't matter what context, whether it's patient outcomes, whether it's a good product, whether there's a low wastage. I mean, for example, utility workers. you want them to be able to identify the structures in the roads and in the footpaths. Because if they fail to identify something like a high voltage cable or a gas cable or a high pressure water main, somebody's going to get very seriously injured or killed. It's the same in the operating room. If the trainee does not know that they've enacted a serious critical error or done something that compromises the patient, and we see this all the time. We see trainees, there's a hemorrhage in the abdomen, and the rest of the team can see this pool of blood just growing and growing, and the operating trainee doesn't see it. We want to avoid that at all costs.
Tony, you're very clear that simulators can teach bad behaviours as easily as good ones. What goes wrong when an organisation buys a simulator and just tells people to practice on it?
Buying the simulator and just telling people to practice on is a fundamental mistake that I see so many organisations making. Simulators are designed or built by engineers, not by clinicians. A simulator it should be built on the metrics first. You shouldn't actually go and buy a simulator that looks more or less what I would want to train that behaviour. That's wrong, because the simulator, it's got to emulate the procedure in the sequence with the devices that you're going to perform the procedure in. The closer it is, the better. The best simulators are in endovascular medicine. But a simulator is just a tool for the delivery of a curriculum, but it's a metric-based curriculum. And so what the organisation needs to do first is they need to develop the metrics, and then take it to the Delphi and get consensus. Okay, the metrics are reasonable, they're in line with the instruction for use, and so on. And then the construct validity, so that they know they'll have a proficiency benchmark, but also they'll know which phases of the task or the procedure that the trainees struggle with most. Now they're ready to go to a simulation company and say, this is what we want, these are the metrics that we want, and we're particularly concerned about these phases of the procedure. I've seen some simulators that actually teach bad behaviour. For example, for the endovascular procedures where you're using a contrast agent and fluoroscopy, you can put your foot on the fluoroscopy pedal and keep it on for the entire procedure, and there's no consequences. Other simulators that I've worked with, simulation companies, for example, for mechanical thrombectomy for acute stroke, that's immediately red flagged. I mean, there should be a duration. And the clinicians, for example, the interventional neuroradiologists, they basically said, okay, at certain times you've got to use fluoroscopy, at other times you don't really have to, but if they do, there's got to be a certain limit on it. The other thing is, one of the simulators that we were working with, they had a microcatheter that we could simulate going up into the brain with a stent retriever on it. And again, there was contrast agent and fluoroscopy used. And the syringe that they used was basically just a syringe with air. And you could plunge the plunger at great speed down the syringe. And what the interventional neuroradiologist said, absolutely not. What that trains is dangerous behaviour. If a trainee in the cath lab plunges the contrast agent at that speed, they're going to damage one of the vessels. And so what we insisted, the company pushed against that, simulation company pushed against that, and we insisted that they develop something that was actually more realistic to the injection of contrast agent in the brain. And they did develop something, and they went off and patented, and it enormously improved their simulation for mechanical thrombectomy. So had we not have had the metrics, had we not had experienced interventional neuroradiologists there, and had we simply had people looking at, yeah, that looks about right. Here was a small detail, that the fact that they were plunged, small detail that could have actually led to a very serious complication in a patient. And the rules are very simple. It's very easy to train bad behaviour. If you're not telling the trainee, no, actually, you're not supposed to do that, trainees will acquire that bad behaviour and they will take it into the work environment, whether that's a cath lab, whether it's a surgical operating theatre, whether it's working on the roads, identifying utilities, or whether it's working on a production line. And we have to be very vigilant to training bad behaviours. But only if you can probably only identify that if you have the performance metrics and individuals who are actually good at the task to be learned.
Okay. And Tony, you then argue that proficiency criteria should be set by a representative sample of experts and not by the top 1%. Why not aim for the very best?
We don't aim for the very best for a very good reason. If you set the benchmark on the top 1%, I mean, almost no trainees will get to that benchmark. There's another problem as well. The top 1% frequently aren't the top 1% in terms of doing the procedure. And that's easily spotted when you get to the, establishing the proficiency benchmark. So number one, top 1%, some of them may not be. You can identify that quantitatively, and I've previously published how you actually statistically deal with that. Anybody that's more than any expert that's more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean, they're out of the benchmarking. Number two, the vast majority of surgeons or clinicians or workers, they go into their job Monday to Friday and they do a first-class job. They work, they're safe, they're productive. And it struck me as that was a reasonable approach to establishing a benchmark. So establishing it on the top 1% would make it too difficult and too challenging for the trainees to actually reach that proficiency benchmark. And this is a process of training. We're just trying to establish their basic skills, but we're also trying to make sure they can do the procedure safely. And they can develop their skills subsequently to, reach the top 1%. But to be quite frank, you don't need the top 1%. You need somebody that can do the procedure, they can do it safely and in a timely fashion.
And you speak about timely fashion, but this paper also says that time as a standalone metric is not just crude, it can be dangerous. If you're not measuring time, what are you measuring?
Yeah, time as a metric for the assessment of performance has been used for a very long time. And it goes all the way back to, pre-anesthesia times, where the surgeon actually the patient wasn't anesthetized. And so if they were amputating a limb, they had to do it as quickly as possible because the patient would have died from the pain. And that seems to almost be a historical measure of what was assumed. One of the things about time, somebody can do a procedure quickly, and they can do it truly appallingly. They could do it very well, but they could also do it appallingly. And unless you have some metrics that are indicative of the quality of the procedure, you really have no idea what you're getting. And there's also a time to do the procedure and an accuracy and error trade-off. The faster you're doing something, the more likely you are to make a mistake. It's much, much better if they're going at a timely fashion at learning it. They will become quicker. If you train somebody to be fast initially, they're going to make lots of errors. Whereas if you train them to automate their skills, to know what steps of the procedure to do, what instruments to do, by sheer historical development of their skills, they're going to become fast or quicker. And to be quite frank, I'll take reasonably, able to do the procedure in a reasonable time frame rather than somebody that can do it fast. And even for procedures such as mechanical thrombectomy for acute stroke, time is supposed to be of the essence. Yeah, time is of the essence, and you want the person to be identified, triaged in hospital, and get to the cath lab as quickly as possible. But if you have somebody doing the procedure very quickly, they're more likely to make an error. And in the brain, you absolutely do not want that because they themselves can lacerate a vessel. They can cause a hemorrhage themselves. So time on its own is not a good metric.
Mm-hmm. And finally, for this paper, Tony, you wrote in 2005 that proficiency-based progression would apply beyond surgery to any interventional discipline and any high-stakes skill. 20 years on, where has that prediction landed, do you think?
Well, there's good news and bad news. I mean, yes, proficiency-based progression has been applied across medical disciplines. It's been everything from communication skills to robotic surgery, to laparoscopic surgery, to endovascular procedures. It's been cardiologists, radiologists, anaesthetists, and intensive care. And the results are always the same. That if you identify the metrics from individuals who are genuinely good at the procedure, it translates, and you use those benchmarks in training, it translates into significantly improved performance outcomes. What we're seeing is about 60% improvement. We've worked in the utility sector, and we're seeing the exact same findings. We're seeing a 60% improvement. And the reason we're seeing that is that the proficiency-based progression was developed from first principles in the scientific method. Proficiency-based progression is not the same as the conventional approaches to training, which are apprenticeship, which are experiential, where there's assumptions made. Proficiency-based progression makes no assumptions. The trainee has to demonstrate in the online didactic that they're ready to go to the skills lab. They do not get to the skills lab until they demonstrate that. In the skills lab, they have to demonstrate that they have the skills, the knowledge and the skills to progress to the operating room. And that applies, it doesn't matter what sector that you're talking about, the same principles would apply. And the paper that we published in PLOS ONE a few years back looked at the utility sector. Okay, most of the work that I've done is in medicine, where we're talking about a high-performing, intelligent, hard-working graduates in university who are going to go on to become consultants or attendings. In the utility sector, what we were dealing with was individuals who left schools with little or no qualifications, who are having to use complex instrumentation, not dissimilar from ultrasound, to identify structures in the road, such as gas cables, high voltage lines, which are all dangerous to hit if they strike, with a jackhammer. And what we found was the exact same as we did in medicine, but we went all the way to an outcome. A lot of the studies in medicine really stop when we get to the simulation lab. They might go to the operating room, and we look at how did they perform intraoperatively? But very few of the studies actually look at, what sort of outcomes do the patients, those trainees operate on, what were the patient outcomes? In the utility study, we went all the way to outcomes. We followed up the trainees that had been trained to proficiency, and we compared them to the results of years where they hadn't been trained. And what we saw was a 60% savings in the costs of utility strikes. The utility strike bill was reduced by 60%, which saved millions to the company involved. So the principles in practice apply to any industry.
Good to know. And for any industry out there, good to take note.